The air in the mess tent at Forward Operating Base Cinder was a thick, syrupy concoction of smells. It was composed, in equal and aggressive parts, of industrial-grade coffee that had been simmering since the dawn of the deployment, the acrid tang of diesel fumes from the generators that powered this small island of humanity in a sea of hostile grit, and the faint, ever-present scent of ozone from the overworked server racks in the adjacent communications hub. It was the smell of perseverance, of boredom, of institutionalized life lived at the sharp end of the spear. The light was just as unforgiving, a flat, sterile glare from long, fluorescent tubes that hummed with a low, monotonous drone, casting no true shadows, only a pervasive, weary illumination that seemed to bleach the color from everything it touched. Metal tables, bolted to the plywood floor, were arranged in rigid, uninviting rows. To sit at one was to feel the slight, perpetual vibration of the base's lifeblood. The generators, the air conditioners, the very thrum of military existence. In this environment of calculated noise and engineered discomfort, she sat alone. To the casual observer, and indeed to every observer who had thus far noticed her, she was a study in profound unremarkability. Sergeant Eva Rostova was a name on a roster, a body in a uniform, a pair of boots on the ground. Her uniform, a standard-issue operational camouflage pattern, was clean but worn, the fabric softened by 100 cycles of wash and wear, its colors faded not by the sun, but by the harsh detergents of the industrial laundry services. It fit her in a way that suggested it was merely a container, functional and devoid of any personal vanity. Her hair, a nondescript shade of brown, was pulled back into a severe regulation bun that was brutally efficient. Her face was plain, unadorned by makeup, and often held an expression of neutral concentration, as if she were perpetually solving a complex but uninteresting mathematical problem in her head. She was neither tall nor short, neither heavy nor slight. She was the human equivalent of a gray rock on a gravel road, present but unseen, a piece of the background scenery that the eye simply slides over on its way to something more compelling. She sat with a book in her hands, a thick, dense technical manual on encrypted frequency hopping protocols, its cover a bland government issue blue. Her focus was absolute. The clamor of the mess tent, the scraping of chairs, the loud boasts of her fellow soldiers, it was all just data, filtered out by a mind that had designated it as irrelevant. The mess tent door slammed open, a violent percussion that momentarily cut through the drone. Staff Sergeant Barnes entered, and the ambient energy of the room immediately shifted, coalescing around him. He was the antithesis of Sergeant Rostova. Where she was silence, he was noise. Where she was stillness, he was kinetic, disruptive energy. Barnes was a large man, not with the lean, sculpted physique of a special operator, but with the thick, brutish build of a high school linebacker who had never quite let go of his glory days. His face looked like it had been carved from naval tradition itself, all sharp angles and a jaw that seemed permanently set in a state of belligerent confidence. Authority, or what he perceived as authority, radiated from him like heat from a furnace. He moved with an unearned swagger, a man who had mistaken his own volume for value. He was trailed by his usual coterie, a pair of younger, sycophantic corporals who laughed a little too loudly at his jokes and mirrored his aggressive posture. Barnes was a product of a certain kind of institutional culture, a man who believed the hierarchy was a ladder to be climbed by stepping on the hands of those below. Barnes scanned the room, his eyes sweeping over the tables like a searchlight. His gaze was proprietary. He was not looking for a place to sit. He was surveying his domain. He saw Rostova. It was not the first time he had seen her, but it was the first time he had truly registered her presence as an anomaly, a piece of data that did not fit his established pattern. She was sitting at his table. It was not officially his, of course, but custom and intimidation had made it so. It was the table near the main entrance, the one with the best view of the comings and goings, the unofficial throne room from which he held court. And she was there, a quiet, unassuming null point in his field of energy. Her very presence an act of passive defiance. Her quietness irritated him. It was unnatural. In his world, people were loud, they postured, they competed for attention. Her silence was a vacuum, and his ego abhorred it. He strode toward the table, his boots thudding against the plywood floor with deliberate emphasis. His two acolytes followed, fanning out slightly behind him like a predator's wingman. The low chatter in their immediate vicinity died down as other soldiers sensed the impending confrontation. It was a familiar piece of theater on the FOB. Barnes would find a target, someone quiet, someone new, someone he perceived as weak, and he would perform his dominance play. It was a crude but effective method of reinforcing his status. He stopped directly in front of her table, planting his large hands on its surface and leaning forward, invading her personal space. She did not look up. Her eyes remained fixed on the complex diagram on page 274 of her manual. "You lost, sweetheart?" Barnes's voice was a low growl, laced with a condescending sweetness that was more insulting than any shout. It was a performance, and the entire room was now his audience. Rotova finished reading the sentence she was on. She then, with a slowness that was itself a form of defiance, raised her eyes. They were a pale, dispassionate gray, and they met his with the calm, analytical curiosity of a biologist studying a particularly loud insect. There was no fear in them, no anger, no emotion at all. It was this unnerving placidity that truly set him off. He expected fear, or at least a flicker of intimidated respect. He received nothing. "This is a communal table, Staff Sergeant," she said. Her voice was as calm and neutral as her expression, a simple statement of fact. She did not call him Sir. She used his rank as a designation, not an honorific. The distinction was subtle, but to a man like Barnes, whose entire identity was wrapped in the fragile tapestry of rank and respect, it was a slap in the face. One of his corporals snickered. Barnes's face tightened, a dull red flush creeping up his neck. He had expected a quick, satisfying victory, a public humbling of a quiet subordinate. Instead, he was being met with a wall of serene indifference. She was not playing her assigned part in his drama. "This is my table," he snarled, leaning in closer. The smell of stale coffee on his breath washed over her. "And I don't recall inviting any comms nerds to sit with the grunts, so why don't you take your little book and go find a corner to hide in?" She did not flinch. She did not turn. Her gaze remained locked on his, steady and unblinking. It was a look that seemed to see right through his bluster, to the soft, insecure core beneath. She was a lioness allowing a jackal to dance at the edge of its kill radius, observing its frantic displays with a kind of weary patience, knowing that a single, effortless movement could end the performance at any moment. The onlookers felt it too. The tension in the room was no longer about a bully picking on a victim. It was something stranger, something more profound. They were watching two different species interact, one governed by loud instinct and the other by a quiet, incomprehensible intelligence. Frustration boiled over into action. Barnes was a physical man, and when his words failed, his hands took over. He swept his arm across the table, not at her, but at her belongings. The thick manual and her half-full canteen of water went flying. The book hit the floor with a heavy, definitive thud. The canteen clattered, its contents splashing across the gritty plywood. It was a childish, brutish act, and it broke the spell of silence. A few soldiers shifted uncomfortably. This was more than the usual posturing. Rostova's gaze finally broke from his. She looked down at her book lying open on the floor, its pages bent. Then she looked at the spreading puddle of water. A flicker of something crossed her face, but it was not anger. It was a fleeting expression of disappointment. Not for herself, but for him. It was the look of a master craftsman observing a shoddy, amateurish piece of work. Then her face returned to its state of placid neutrality. She slowly pushed her chair back, bent down with an economy of motion that was almost graceful, and picked up her book. She checked the pages for damage, carefully straightening a bent corner before closing it. She did not pick up the canteen. She straightened up and placed the manual back on the table. She looked at Barnes, who stood there, chest puffed out, a triumphant sneer on his face. He had finally provoked a reaction, forced her to move, to acknowledge his physical power. He believed he had won. That was when the world ended. It began not with a bang, but with a sound that was far more terrifying, a sudden, absolute silence, the constant, reassuring hum of the generators, the drone of the lights, the whir of the ventilation. It all ceased at once. The mess tent was plunged into a half-second of pure, primordial darkness and silence. Then, the emergency lights flickered on, casting the room in a hellish, pulsating red glow. Before anyone could process the power failure, the first explosion hit. It was not distant. It was close. A deep, concussive whoomp that felt like a giant fist striking the very earth beneath them. The entire tent shook violently, and the air was punched from a dozen lungs at once. Panic, a wild and feral thing, was born in that moment. Men who were trained for combat, men who had faced firefights and IEDs, were momentarily undone by the sheer unexpectedness of the attack. It was a complex, coordinated assault. A second and third explosion followed in rapid succession, one striking the perimeter wall and the other, terrifyingly, hitting the communications hub next door. The air filled with the shriek of tearing metal and the smell of burning electronics. The base's alert system, a series of powerful sirens, should have been screaming. They were silent. The attack had been surgical. They had been decapitated. Power, communications, command, all gone in a matter of seconds. In the crimson, strobing chaos, conventional authority evaporated. The highest-ranking officer in the tent, a young lieutenant, was frozen in place, his face a mask of shock. Staff Sergeant Barnes, the self-proclaimed king of this small domain, reacted with the only tool he possessed: volume. "Get down! Everyone get down!" he bellowed, his voice tight with fear masquerading as command. It was the textbook response, but it was a useless one. They were already under attack. Hiding under tables would not save them. His corporals echoed his shouts, adding to the noise but not to the solution. They were chickens squawking in a burning coop. Then, through the cacophony and the flickering red light, a figure moved. It was Rotova. While everyone else dropped to the floor or stood frozen in shock, she rose from her chair. She was no longer the quiet, unassuming sergeant. A transformation had occurred. The placid neutrality of her face was gone, replaced by an expression of intense, focused analysis. Her eyes, which had been calm and gray, now seemed to burn with a cold, blue fire. They darted around the room, not in panic, but in a rapid, systematic assessment of the situation. She was not seeing chaos. She was seeing data points, structural integrity of the tent, location of exits, the state of the soldiers around her. She moved with a sudden, breathtaking purpose. It was not the hurried scramble of fear, but the fluid, economical grace of a predator. She did not run. She flowed through the chaos, a river of calm in a torrent of panic. She moved past the cowering lieutenant, past the shouting Barnes, and headed directly for the wreckage of the communications hub. Barnes saw her move. "Sergeant! Get back here! That's an order!" he yelled, his authority already sounding hollow and pathetic in the face of the real crisis. She did not even pause. His voice was just more irrelevant noise. She disappeared through the torn flap of the mess tent, heading toward the heart of the danger. A strange compulsion, a mix of fury at her defiance and a dawning, terrifying curiosity, seized Barnes. He scrambled to his feet and followed her, shouting for her to stop. The scene outside was one of calculated destruction. The communications hub was a ruin of twisted metal and sparking wires. The attack had been precise, designed to cripple their ability to coordinate a defense or call for help. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, or what was left of it, the situation was even worse. The handful of officers and enlisted personnel on duty were wandering in a daze, their faces lit by the strobing red of the emergency alerts and the blue glow of dying screens. The air was thick with smoke. "Status report," a captain was yelling into a dead radio handset. "I need a sit rep now." Rotova entered the talk and the room seemed to bend around her. She ignored the captain. She ignored the smoke and the chaos. She walked directly to the main server rack, the one that was now a mangled mess of circuits and sheared cables. Her movements were precise, her hands sure. She pulled a multi-tool from a pouch on her belt that no one had ever noticed before. With swift, expert motions, she began to triage the system. She was not a soldier. She was a surgeon operating on the base's central nervous system. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Sergeant?" the captain demanded, finally noticing her. She didn't look at him. Her fingers were a blur, pulling out fried circuit boards, rerouting power cables, her mind working at a speed that was patently inhuman. "The primary command node is severed," she stated, her voice cutting through the panic with clinical precision. "The encrypted uplinks are fried. They targeted the fiber optic conduits, not just the power grid. It was smart, very smart." She spoke as if admiring the enemy's handiwork. She turned to a terrified-looking communications specialist. "You," she said, her voice not asking but commanding. "I need a satellite phone, a high-gain antenna, and a portable power cell. Now, and get me the schematics for the CRAM's independent targeting system, the one that's supposed to be offline." The specialist, a corporal, looked helplessly at the captain. The captain, flustered and out of his depth, just stared at Rotova. "Who are you to give orders?" Rotova finally turned her head and looked at him. The full force of her focused will, the immense, compressed power of her intellect and authority, hit him like a physical blow. "I am the person who is going to stop us all from dying in the next 10 minutes, she said, her voice flat, cold, and utterly convincing. "Get me what I asked for." The captain, a man who had been trained his entire adult life to command, found himself nodding and relaying her orders. Barnes stood in the doorway, his mouth agape, watching this impossible scene unfold. The quiet, mousy woman from the mess tent was now running the defense of the entire base, and everyone, from the officers down, was obeying her without question. The equipment was brought. Rotova worked with a furious intensity that was mesmerizing. She bypassed the base's entire destroyed communications network, jury-rigging a direct satellite link from scratch. Her fingers flew across the keypad of the sat phone, entering codes and executing commands that were a foreign language of expertise. She wasn't just calling for help. She was reprogramming the base's automated defenses on the fly. "They're using a ghost signal to spoof our IFF," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "Clever, but noisy." On a salvaged laptop powered by the portable cell, she began writing code. Lines of script scrolled across the screen at a dizzying pace. She was fighting a war in cyberspace, a battle of pure information, while the physical battle raged outside. "CRAM is back online," she announced, not looking up from the screen. "I've uploaded a new threat recognition algorithm. It will ignore the spoofing signal. Anything that isn't broadcasting the new handshake code gets shredded." As if on cue, the air was split by a sound like a giant tearing a canvas sheet the size of the sky. The deafening brrr-ta of a phalanx CIWS, the close-in weapon system, firing. The weapon, which everyone had assumed was disabled, was now active, a guard dog brought back to life, spewing a torrent of 20-millimeter rounds into the sky. A moment later, a series of secondary explosions lit up the night as the CRAM intercepted a volley of incoming mortar rounds. The room was silent, save for the hum of the laptop and the distant roar of the CIWS. Everyone, the captain, the specialists, Barnes, stared at her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. They were not just watching a competent soldier. They were witnessing a master at her craft, a virtuoso performing a symphony of technological warfare. She had single-handedly restored the base's shield and its voice in under 5 minutes. It was into this tableau of stunned silence that the general arrived. The heavy thud of rotor blades had been approaching for the last few minutes, a sound of hope and salvation. A Black Hawk helicopter, flying without lights, landed hard just outside the TOC. The door slid open, and out stepped General Madsen, commander of all coalition forces in the theater. He was a living legend, a man whose face was etched with the gravity of 3 decades of command. He was flanked by 2 enormous, silent commandos. Madsen strode into the wrecked TOC, his eyes taking in the scene with a practiced, all-encompassing glance. His face was a thundercloud. "What in the goddamned hell happened to my C3I?" he boomed, his voice accustomed to instant obedience. The captain stepped forward, stammering. "General, sir, we were hit by a complex attack. They took out power and comms. We were blind." Madsen's gaze swept past the captain, past the smoking consoles and the wide-eyed soldiers. He was looking for the source of the solution, not the source of the problem. His eyes landed on the jury-rigged command post, the spooling cables, the laptop, and the figure hunched over it. He saw the CRAM status glowing green on the screen. He saw the secure uplink signal, a signal he recognized, a signal that shouldn't have been possible from a base this remote. And then he saw her. He started walking toward her, his heavy boots crunching on shattered glass. The other soldiers parted before him like water. He stopped a few feet from her workstation. She was still typing, her concentration absolute. She hadn't even registered his arrival. His eyes narrowed. He looked at her face, then at her hands, a blur of motion on the keyboard. His gaze drifted to her left forearm, where her sleeve had been pushed up in the heat of her work. There, partially visible just above her wrist, was a small, intricate tattoo. It was not a decorative piece. It was a symbol, a stylized bird of prey, a kestrel with a single star clutched in its talons. A look of utter, profound astonishment washed over General Madsen's face. The thundercloud vanished, replaced by something else entirely: recognition, and something akin to reverence. He drew himself up to his full height. His posture, already ramrod straight, became impossibly rigid. He took a sharp breath, and in a voice that cracked like a rifle shot through the stunned silence of the room, he bellowed a command that no one there had ever heard, directed at a mere sergeant. "Attention on deck!" Instinct and training took over. Every soldier in the room, from the petrified captain to the dumbstruck Barnes, snapped to the position of attention. It was a chaotic, clumsy shuffling of feet, but it was absolute. Rotova finally stopped typing. The command had penetrated her bubble of concentration. She slowly turned her head, her eyes blinking as if adjusting to a new light. She looked up at the towering figure of General Madsen, who stood before her, locked at the most rigid and respectful position of attention she had ever seen a four-star general hold. He did not speak to her as a general to a sergeant. He spoke to her as a subordinate. "Ma'am," he said, his voice filled with a deference that bordered on awe. "Colonel Rotova, I was not aware you were in theater. Your name wasn't on any operational manifest." He paused, his eyes flicking to the tattoo again. "My apologies. Kestrel." The name descended upon the room like a physical weight. Kestrel. It was a whisper, a ghost story told in classified briefing rooms and intel schools. Not a person, but a legend. The architect of the Ghost Protocol, the woman who had single-handedly dismantled the information networks of two enemy nations. A cyber warfare prodigy who had been sheep-dipped into the enlisted ranks for a deep-cover intelligence operation so secret that even a theater commander like Madsen was not on the need-to-know list. The rank of colonel was a formality. Her actual authority transcended the conventional chain of command. She was a strategic asset, a weapon system in human form, and Staff Sergeant Barnes had told her to go hide in a corner. The blood drained from Barnes's face. His knees felt weak. The universe, as he had understood it, had been irrevocably shattered. The floor beneath him was no longer solid. He was staring at a figure of myth, a ghost made of flesh and blood, a woman he had tried to humiliate for his own petty amusement. The sheer, cataclysmic scale of his mistake was so immense that his mind could not fully process it. It was like trying to look at the sun. Rotova, now Colonel Rotova to the rest of the world, simply looked at the general. "My operational parameters were discreet, General," she said, her voice returning to its calm, neutral tone. "The situation required a more direct intervention." "I see that," Madsen said, finally relaxing slightly from his position of attention. A slow smile spread across his face. "It's good to have you on our side of the wire, Kestrel." The crisis was averted. The base was saved. Reinforcements were on their way, guided in by the secure link Rotova had forged from nothing. But for the men in the Teoks, the real battle had just been fought and won, and it had nothing to do with mortars or ghost signals. It was a battle of perception, and they had all lost, spectacularly. Later, after the immediate threat had passed and a semblance of order had been restored, Rotova stood in the temporary command post that had been established. General Madsen was at her side, listening with rapt attention as she gave a technical debrief that was so complex, so layered with nuance and strategic foresight, that it was clear she was operating on a level of understanding that was galaxies beyond anyone else on the base. It was then that she saw Staff Sergeant Barnes. He was being held to one side by two of the general's commandos, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terror that was existential. He was a man waiting for the axe to fall. The UCMJ had 1,000 articles to cover this: striking an officer, disrespecting a superior officer. The fact that he hadn't known she was an officer would be no defense. His career was over. A prison sentence was a distinct possibility. Rotova finished her debrief. She turned to General Madsen. "General, one final piece of administrative business." "Anything, Colonel. You name it," Madsen replied. Her cool, gray eyes found Barnes. She walked over to him, the two commandos tensing as she approached. Barnes flinched, expecting a blow, a curse, a final, devastating condemnation. She stopped in front of him. She looked at him, not with anger, but with that same unnerving, analytical gaze she had used in the mess tent. It was the look of a scientist examining a failed experiment, trying to understand the precise point of malfunction. "Your mistake was not personal, Staff Sergeant," she began, her voice quiet but carrying in the silent room. "It was tactical. You made an assessment based on incomplete and flawed intelligence. You saw a quiet woman in a sergeant's uniform, and you populated that data point with a host of incorrect assumptions based on your own biases. Your prejudice is a critical vulnerability. In a combat environment, a vulnerability like that is not a personality flaw. It is a liability that can get people killed." She paused, letting the words sink in. Barnes could only stare, his throat too dry to speak. "A court-martial would be inefficient," she continued. "It would teach you a lesson about punishment, but not about perception. I find that to be an inadequate outcome." She turned to the general. "Sir, I request that Staff Sergeant Barnes be reassigned. Effective immediately, he will serve as my personal administrative aide for the remainder of my deployment." A murmur went through the room. General Madsen raised an eyebrow, a flicker of a smile playing on his lips. He understood immediately. It was not an act of mercy. It was a sentence far more profound than any prison term. It was a sentence of forced education. "Your request is granted, Colonel," Madsen said. Rotova turned back to Barnes. "You will be with me every day, Staff Sergeant. You will handle my scheduling. You will maintain my equipment. You will sit in on my briefings. You will observe. You will process the data. And you will learn to see the difference between a person's container and their contents. That is your new mission. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am," Barnes choked out, the word ma'am feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. It was the first word of his new education. The story of that night passed into the permanent lore of the United States military. It became a modern fable, told and retold in barracks and training academies, the details shifting and embellishing with each telling. It was called the Kestrel in the Mess Hall, or sometimes Barnes's Bad Day. It served as a potent living reminder that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield is not always the one that makes the most noise. The quiet professional, the hidden master, could be anywhere, in any uniform. The legend of Colonel Eva Kestrel Rotova became a teaching tool, a cautionary tale against the fatal sin of arrogance. Years passed. The dust of FOB Cinder settled into memory. In a brightly lit classroom at the Senior Non-Commissioned Officer Academy in Fort Bliss, Texas, a master sergeant stood before a class of cocky, newly promoted sergeants first class. He was an older man now, his face lined with experience, his once brash demeanor replaced by a quiet, unshakable gravity. It was Master Sergeant Barnes. He was one of the most respected and effective instructors at the academy, known for his uncanny ability to teach the one subject that wasn't in any of the manuals: humility. He stood before his class, his gaze sweeping over the young, proud faces, and he saw himself in every one of them. He saw the unearned confidence, the reliance on the superficial armor of rank and reputation. "Let me tell you a story," he began, his voice low and steady. "It's about the biggest mistake I ever made. It's about a time I confused a lioness for a lamb, because I was too stupid and too arrogant to see what was right in front of me. I looked at a quiet sergeant reading a book, and I saw a victim. I did not see the architect of our entire digital defense network. I saw a woman, and I did not see a weapon of strategic importance. My failure of perception almost cost an entire base." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with each of his students in turn. "Your biggest threat on the battlefield will not be the enemy you can see. It will be the assumptions you carry inside you. The person you underestimate, the quiet specialist you dismiss, the subordinate you fail to listen to. They may hold the key to your survival. Your job is not to command. It is to see competence in all its forms, to recognize strength, even when it is silent." He paused, and a ghost of a memory crossed his face. "I learned that lesson from the best, and it was a hard lesson. Don't make the same mistake I did. Look past the uniform, look past the rank, look for the substance, because true authority is not worn on a collar, it is demonstrated in a crisis." The story, in the end, was not about a colonel disguised as a sergeant. It was about a much more common and dangerous disguise, the one worn by ignorance when it calls itself authority. It is a timeless lesson, reaching far beyond the confines of a dusty FOB. In every hospital, in every boardroom, in every laboratory, there are kestrels. They are the quiet ones, the unassuming professionals who are the true load-bearing walls of any organization. They are the ones who do not seek the spotlight, for they are too busy ensuring the lights stay on for everyone else. They are the substance in a world that too often rewards style. Their authority is not granted by a title, but earned through a mastery so profound that it needs no announcement. It is a quiet, powerful force, waiting patiently for the moment of crisis when the loud and the arrogant fail, and the real work needs to be done. It is a reminder that the most powerful voice in the room is not always the loudest. Sometimes it is the one that has no need to speak at all, for its actions are the only argument it will ever need.